Right, let's make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're really pleased to have you all with us today. Before we begin, let's just run through a couple of housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphones muted so we don't get all that background noise. And if you're comfortable though, we'd love to keep your cameras on, so help us connect with you that way. If you have any questions during the presentation, just drop them in the Q&A chat there and we'll endeavour to get through them before the end. At Hatch House, our mission's pretty simple. We want to feed the world. And to do that, we need to help farmers produce the best, most sustainable protein possible. We work alongside farmers, owners, and managers to implement strategies to drive growth while maintaining the highest standards of animal welfare. We help you maintain flock health, meet compliance requirements, and put in place strong biosecurity and management systems. Our team combines veterinary experience with operational experience, offering support in areas like vet diagnostics and flock management, biosecurity planning, compliance advice, operational and production support in any system. Before we start today's session, I'd like to quickly introduce some of our team. Dr. Alex-Kate Langford, our Senior Veterinarian and Director, who leads much of the technical and health-focused work across the poultry sector. Dr. Amira Mikhail, Associate Veterinarian, bringing a wealth of experience from biosecurity, animal welfare regulation, and exotic disease response. Myself, Chris Martin, as Director of Operations, focusing on strategy management and industry engagement. And last but not least, Jessica Klosterman, our Operations Coordinator. Every Batman needs a Robin, and Jess is the one who keeps all our projects and our clients running smoothly. Together, we bring a balance of veterinary knowledge and practical operational support to help producers achieve your goals. If today sparks any ideas or raises questions on your own farm or operation, we'd love to continue the conversation. Head over to hatchhousehq.com and navigate to the commercial section and book a discovery call. It's our chance to get to know your operation better and showcase how we can help you achieve your goals. So without talking any more, let's hand over to Alex-Kate to take us through the webinar.
Hey everyone, thanks Chris for that great intro. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully we can all see it. Over the next hour, we're really going to explore how data-driven monitoring, attentive observation and proactive management can really transform flock health and productivity. Our goal today really is to show that early detection and targeted intervention can make a tangible difference to your farm's performance and your bird's well-being. We most likely won't touch on everything today, as you can appreciate the level of depth that would be required to do that. But if you do want more information or any more detail, flick us an email or post your questions in the Q&A, or put your hand up or raise your hand, and I will jump in and hopefully answer the questions as we go. So let's dive in. So routine flock health monitoring is really foundational to precision poultry production. By regularly collecting a lot of the data, and I'm a bit of a data nut, we can sort of detect subtle changes long before they become a problem. Monitoring allows us to catch diseases early, track the effectiveness of vaccination or nutrition or worming programs, and really optimize the welfare and recognise those behavioural trends over time. But most importantly, it lets us compare actual performance against the breed standards, but also the farm history, enabling us to have timely adjustments that protect birds and improve your bottom line. Let's talk about stress. We are no strangers to stress. We're in the poultry industry. We're no stranger to the biological response that stress presents. We know that short-term stress we can handle. It helps us and it helps our chickens adapt to the world around us. But chronic stress is harmful. And the way it manifests itself in poultry is it's not just a welfare issue, it's a major driver of immunosuppression and disease susceptibility. Heat and cold, overcrowding, social disruption, or abrupt feed changes really activate that hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And the HPA axis releases the stress hormone, cortisol and adrenaline. And sustained activation of this cortisol release suppresses antibody production, which is important for our vaccination and the immunity of our birds. It impairs mucosal immunity, and it increases the susceptibility of our birds to pathogens. So when birds are under stress, they tend to eat less, they grow slower, they produce fewer eggs. And so recognizing and mitigating some stresses early is really key to, overall component of flock health. And this is why we really emphasize not just the presence of a stressor, but also the duration of which that stressor is in place, and then how our birds respond to that stressor over time. So let's unpack the physiology a little bit further. The HPA axis is the bird's main stress system. Under this general adaptation syndrome, we underpin the understanding of how stress in birds presents itself. It's really separated into three components. First, we've got the alarm stage, and this is characterized by that rapid neuroendocrine response. It's where we get adrenaline and cortisone really spiking and surging. And this enhances our cardiovascular input. It enhances mobilizing of glucose and energy into the body, and temporarily suppresses those non-essential functions like digestion or reproduction. So the easiest way to describe this is you're being chased by a lion. The last thing you really need to be thinking about is digesting lunch that I had a couple of hours ago. So all the energy gets pushed away from that digestion tract and from, non-essential areas to fuel the legs that we need to run away from the lion. In the resistance phase, the bird appears clinically normal, but metabolically, it is quite strained. Adaptation really requires a lot of substantial energy and diversion of resources away from, more of those in need kind of components like immunity or growth, for instance. So if that stressor persists without a resolution, the flock really enters into this exhaustion phase, which is our third component to the GAS system. And here we have chronic cortisone elevation levels. That leads to chronic lymphoid or immunity atrophy, where the immune system isn't functioning at its best. It suppresses antibody production for our vaccinations, and it reduces our gastrointestinal integrity and our reproductive decline. So the key takeaway from this really is that flock monitoring sort of enables us to detect early physiological drift between these three stages. So reduced feed intake or irregular behaviour patterns or mild change in production curves can be sort of identified within that resistance phase. And this is really that critical window where we want to put in place some remedial action before that irreversible exhaustion sets in and the birds sort of come to the end of being able to cope with that stress. But how do we translate that physiology into actionable data? Well, we use both active and passive indicators. And active indicators are really those metrics that we routinely collect and quantify. So that might be feed intake or water consumption, might be daily egg production, body weight, even maybe uniformity. And these tell us that physiological progression of how the birds are handling their day-to-day lives and allow us to have that quick comparison back to breed standard. Comparatively, we've got our passive indicators, and these are qualitative or subjective data and more reactive. So things like the abnormal droppings that we might see or dirty water lines, comb colour, feather quality or mortality. And they provide context and are especially really valuable when you do have one of these active indicators that are out of kilter. So say the performance or the production drops. In high performance poultry systems, our goal must be to favour those early detection methods by utilising a combination of active and passive indicators to really give us that complete picture of flock health. Now, that's all good and well, but at the end of the day, we need to know what we're comparing against. So setting some smart production targets plays that critical role in interpreting our flock health indicators. So targets that are specific, that are measurable, that are achievable, realistic and time-bound provide that foundation for evidence-based decision-making. Importantly, they help avoid two common errors. That's overreacting to normal biological variation and underreacting to early signs of compromise. So, for example, a daily water intake of 100 mils per bird may appear low compared to the smart benchmark that you've set yourself, but it may not necessarily take into consideration the season or the outside temperatures or the bird age at that particular time. So without that sort of context, we risk pursuing really unnecessary diagnostics or potentially even overlooking a true deviation. So it's about setting meaningful baselines that reflect that production environment. We can better distinguish the normal variability from emerging risk, and we can also avoid that diagnostic rabbit holes that waste time and resources. After we've sort of defined those smart targets, we've now got to translate them into your structured health and management schedule that you have on farm. And it's not just a calendar. It should be your operational framework that assigns both responsibility, it standardizes the data collection at particular times, and it aligns the interventions with those physiological milestones. So it's quite a dynamic document that should be utilized and reviewed on a regular basis. So daily tasks are, and this is no news for you guys, but should include recording feed and water intake, floor egg trends, temperature, ventilation rates. And then maybe our weekly and bi-weekly should be uniformity checks, post-mortem sampling, environmental audits. And these activities must be really clearly assigned and embedded into the routine of your organisation. So just as vaccination plans are scheduled by age or challenge window, so too should our health checks and data collection. So ensuring that we've got no gaps and we've got clear visibility of flock status. A good plan also includes like those designated training intervals and the contact chains for, say, a veterinary escalation, particularly in the event of, say, like a high mortality or a suspicion of an exotic disease, which no one really wants to talk about right now. So once we've done all that, we really need to interpret the data that you've collected, because data is only as good as the analysis that you can do with it. So you first need to know what's normal. And this isn't necessarily what's normal for the breed standard, because that's often based off that 5% best performance across global networks and doesn't take into account that chain different systems or, pasture raised or free range or cage, doesn't take into a lot of those accounts. So we need to identify what's normal, not only for your strain of bird that you're using, but your management style and also the bird stage of production, and establish that baseline by then comparing that against the breed manuals or potentially your farm's historical data. Ask yourself, does the variation I'm seeing fall within those expected limits that I typically see on my farm? And our observations are a fundamental skill for all kind of stockmanship. So poultry managers, staff, anyone that's got contact with our birds, being able to watch birds from a distance reveals those subtle behavioural changes. So changes maybe in feeding order or the way that they move around a system, the distribution around the shed, vocalization. And so it's really practicing those observation skills that allows you to investigate factors that might contribute or preempt issues before they really spiral out of control. This is a slide that sort of shows on the left-hand side, you've got the grey line, and that is the production standard from the breed standard. And then we've got all these different coloured lines on the right. And what that shows me is, one, it's not meeting the breed standard, but two, it's exceptionally consistent on farm. And what this sort of gives a bit of an idea as to the trends that might help identify meaningful deviations from our expected deviations. So a flock may produce below a breed standard, yet still be above your farm's typical performance. in which case maybe an immediate intervention may not necessarily be warranted. But conversely, if a flock falls below both breed and your historical norms, that's when you want to investigate. So to dive into this graph a little bit further, this particular organisation wanted to delay the onset of lay to allow for a bigger pullet egg or first egg. And so what they did is they made a management decision to light up a couple of weeks later than what the breed standard says. As a result, it has meant that the graphs look like this day in and day out. And that is a management decision and not something that really sparks an investigation or warrant. But as someone without context, you would look at that and go, okay, there's something to fix here, where actually it's been quite a targeted approach. For our broiler guys, really important that we've got this FCR graph, and it shows how feed efficiency evolves across multiple flocks, seasons, months and years. And so we trend FCR over months and years to distinguish improvements or changes based on maybe management changes or medication changes or just natural seasonal patterns. This slide really highlights some improvement patterns that we see. So we can see here in the blue, 2023, we've seen quite a drop in FCR, which is a good thing. So there's been some major improvements here. But we've also seen that throughout this period here, historically across the entire 4-year data period, this has been our worst performing time of year for FCR. Now, understanding why that might be the case or why this might be a higher stress period, well, over this period is summer. So the birds that are processed here quite often are placed throughout the hotter months of our year. So heat stress becomes a concern. Versus here, where historically has been our better performing FCR months, is because they've been placed over a spring period. And, you know, I've had a lot of colleagues and a lot of idols tell me that even the most unexperienced chicken grower can grow birds over a spring period. So it's really understanding a structured approach to seeing patterns, but not just numbers, but those patterns that can guide our decisions and whether further intervention is needed. A real world example, this flock came into lay quite nicely, but egg production really started to tank about that 23-week mark. The first few weeks below target probably weren't overly catastrophic because birds need time to settle into an environment and they need to find their way. But what was really interesting is it just continued to track downwards. So we compare this current performance to what the farm's history is, and this wasn't a similar pattern across flocks. This was a completely different pattern that we had seen before. And so that immediately made us go, we also need to check other indicators. We need to check feed intake, maybe water intake, maybe our body weight, and did we see any behaviour changes here? Because early deviation here might point to a stressor like poor lighting, but it also could be something quite sinister. So understanding context is crucial. So now we start to overlay the data. Same flock, same period of time. We can see the body weights really started to follow that breed standard as expected. Maybe a little bit heavy here before onset of lay, but overall doing pretty good. But then all of a sudden, about the same time that our production dropped, we had this huge drop in body weight before it returned to somewhat normal from then on in. This suggests that either the energy intake or the nutrient absorption was insufficient to not only sustain growth, but also to sustain the egg production that we saw. And so what we did is the curve really supports that concern raised by the egg production data, which is usually the one that we see the first and analyse first, and directed our attention to maybe we need to look at the feed formulation or the feeding schedule or maybe even a disease status. So then we look towards our feed consumption graph, and this was really the final piece of the puzzle. While the flock started off well, sort of following what we would be expected for feed rates, around that 22-week mark or 22-week mark, feed levels really sort of took a dive. We then saw this really strange peak of feed, And then it continued on the same low trajectory for quite a long time post that. And what that showed us, this consistent dip in feed intake compared to the breed standard, indicated that this was most definitely either a nutritional driver of underperformance or maybe a feed availability, or maybe there was something wrong with the birds and the birds weren't eating. So we then went and started looking at what caused that reduction. Was there a heat event around that time of period? Was there a particular formulation change? Was there maybe a water issue? And so linking our feed intake back to our production and back to our body weight, we can really start to build a picture of what happened with this particular flock, because maybe of something that's an upstream driver, likely nutritional or environmental. So it started to give us an idea as to where to start looking. So it's really important that we don't look at single data points to tell us the full story. We've got to layer production performance with feed intake and body weight, water consumption, behaviour, until we start to see a pattern emerge. Deviations in one area often precede others. So overlying timelines of stresses might be heat events or ventilation changes, vaccinations, really help us interpret those shifts day to day or week to week. So when we reviewed the farm records from this, we then started to look at what was going on, and we found that what actually started it was feed intake dropped for the first week, and we picked that up after about the 4th day of the feed consumption dropping to about 90 grams per bird versus the 120 grams per bird that they were meant to be eating. This then precipitated a body weight drop about a week or two after that consistent feed intake drop. And then from that point in time, our egg production then dropped. And so physiologically, that makes sense, right? If they're not eating, they can't sustain the body weight or the growth. And then the first thing that they're most likely going to drop is going to be egg production. And so the birds looked clinically well. They were clinically well. There was no mortality, but there was just very strained feed intake drop. So once we see that consistent pattern, we shift from that monitoring space into the investigation space. And really the key is to avoid the guesswork. You need to work through a really structured framework. So you're not pulling at ideas from a range of different areas and not forming a story. A good colleague of mine, or actually my ex-boss, said to me, if it can't fit a story, then you're missing a key piece to the puzzle, because everything should be logical. And so if that story doesn't fit and it doesn't make sense, there is a piece that you have not got yet to fill that story. So we assessed the 5 key domains. First, we assessed the feed to make sure it was fresh, consistent, correctly formulated, and it was reaching the birds. Next, then we looked at the water, so pressure, hygiene, temperature, the line integrity. Then we looked at environmental data. Did we see spikes in temp, humidity, or ammonia? What was the outside temperature like? Did they get let out? Were they a free-range flock and got let out at that particular time? And then 4th, that behaviour and conditions, so lethargy, pecking, feathering, uniformity. And then the area that, we love is that disease. So, have we got serology? Have we done fecal checks to rule out any subclinical issues? And so by linking our overlay data with real-world records like feed logs and staff changes or vaccine events, we can really identify the root cause with much greater confidence, and we avoid fixing the wrong thing. Oh, sorry, wrong way. This one. The ultimate question everyone says to me is, I don't know when to trigger action. I don't know when I should call you. And my answer to them always is, I would rather you be one day too early than one day too late. Because if you're one day too late, it's really hard to pull yourself back. Where if I'm one day too early, I can preempt. So to trigger action, the easiest way is to identify the thresholds that suit your particular organisation. So identify that threshold so the guesswork is out and you're not having to look at it and go, oh, I wonder whether I should call someone today. It should just be, have we had 2 days of reduced feed or water intake consistently without a known explanation? Yes, call. if egg production starts dipping more than 2% below target for a number of days, should I call someone? Yes, call. No change in weekly body weight gain. Should we see an increase in body weight gain through rearing? If we're not, should we be calling or should we be waiting the next day? And what are those behavioural changes in the birds? So have we got a reduced activity? Have we got increased huddling or feather damage? Intervening during that resistance phase that we talked about is far easier than trying to rescue an exhausted bird. So using your trend direction, not just single values, to inform those decisions and prevent escalation of your birds getting into exhaustion. And even with structure monitoring and thresholds, some issues still progress, right? Like these are livestock, we still have issues that turn up. And so this is where where surveillance programs really come in. So we've got two types of surveillance programs. We've got an active surveillance program, and this is serology or field detections that measure antibody levels or infection without clinical signs. And then our passive surveillance deals with disease diagnosis. So once those clinical signs have appeared, that's when we start investigating. Both feed into a confirmation exclusion pathway. If active testing shows rising titers, we can target, further testing, maybe a PCR or swabbing. And if passive monitoring detects lesions or clinical signs, we can then perform the serology to identify the agent. Surveillance isn't just for research, it's a practical tool when something looks wrong. We'll use it to confirm or investigate. So active surveillance, and most people in their organisations use serology for their active surveillance. It's that proactive tool to track, predict and verify flock health. So an antibody titer graph over time reveals when boosters might be needed or if vaccines are underperforming due to stress or poor technique. It helps measure our maternal antibodies in day-old chicks to plan the timing of when those first vaccinations should be, so we're not too early and the maternal antibodies neutralise the vaccine and we're not too late and the chicks are unprotected. Serology can also screen exposure to field viruses. So birds exposed to a pathogen will develop those antibodies even if they're not vaccinated. So confirming negative status with serology, it really keeps that warning, the early warning level on track. It's especially important for our breeder flocks, and I know we've got some breeder guys on here today, or our export programs or after a specific outbreak. So for an example, in one layer flock, we saw inconsistent production of mild respiratory signs. Serology revealed high titers of a field strain of IB virus despite our vaccination programs. And so what we did is we adjusted the vaccination program to highlight those at-risk periods that those birds would be experiencing to hopefully prevent further production loss. Really, the key principle is that both those surveillance streams are essential. One prevents and the other one explains. So this is particularly important for our health indicators that deviate from the thresholds that we've set. Another real-world example that highlights the value of active surveillance and why we don't wait for birds to look sick before we investigate. In this flock, there was no clinical signs observed. Feed intake, body weight, egg production all stayed within expected ranges. On the surface, everything looked fine. But on our routine serology, part of the farm's structured health plan, it told a much different story. From 24 to 28 weeks, we started, so this here is the production graph. Oops, sorry. And this here is serology for Mycoplasma gallisepticum infection. So from weeks 24 to 28, antibody titers really started to rise here. And this indicated an early unexpected increase, which sort of indicated that there was an immune response occurring. This flock was not vaccinated. And so through Investigator, we were able to identify the cause was Mycoplasma gallisepticum, likely introduced by pullets from a new supplier. And the key takeaway here is that without this routine monitoring that occurred at this point in time, this MG infection could have completely been missed until the bird started to really fall off production here. And so by catching it early, we were able to administer a vaccination on the incoming flocks to prevent the further spread. This graph compares different serological titer levels for different vaccination programs for infectious bronchitis. So for those based in Australia, we only have live vaccinations available to us. For those in New Zealand, you have a live and a killed infectious bronchitis available to you. And all of those and the variations of which we administer it provide a different antibody titer level over time. So the green bar is a live vaccination followed by a live vaccination. So, but with no further vaccinations throughout laying period. So say you gave it at 8 weeks, you gave it at 12 weeks, and then you did nothing from then on in. You can see we get a really nice peak of antibody levels and good immune response early. But then by the end of life, we've really exposed these birds. They've lost that innate protectiveness. With the orange, we've got a live vaccination or 2 live vaccinations followed by a killed vaccination. So this is what we're recommending for those in New Zealand. And what that does is it doesn't give you the really high spike, but it gives you adequate protection and longevity of protection. And then overseas, they've got a killed versus a killed with no live. And again, that gives you a very similar pattern of protectiveness. Now, based on when or what type of program you utilise will depend on where you want to do some of this active surveillance, so your serology surveillance. So here we've got the red, which is a live vaccine every 8 weeks from rearing right through to production. And you can see, even though we've got the troughs and the peaks, we're really staying within this threshold band of protection, which is adequate protection against infectious bronchitis. The live only with no vaccination throughout production, you can really see that about this point and about this point, we're starting to get to the point where these birds are exposed. So if you want to maintain that type of production, that type of program, doing a test at 50 weeks will give you an idea whether you're getting external or environmental exposure to infectious bronchitis, which will give you an idea that if maybe this isn't going to maintain that longevity of protection, and maybe you need to start introducing a live vaccination throughout production as well. And then our live killed, which is our orange up here, has really good protection long term. This point here is super important because it's going to tell us whether we've had adequate protection against infectious bronchitis via our vaccinations. If this isn't at this point, then we need to start questioning about the administration of that vaccination. And if we don't get the longevity, we then start thinking of whether these birds are in that exhausted state where that antibody production is being used up. For our broiler guys, this is just understanding some serology trends for 2 immunosuppressive diseases in broilers, so IBD, infectious bursal disease, and chicken anemia virus. You'll notice that in both graphs, we've got a lot of activity really early on. Now, this is our maternal antibodies, and this is what we would typically expect if the parent flocks were well vaccinated. Throughout the middle period for IBD, we can see very limited activity, similar with the CAV activity, meaning that, the birds are likely unprotected but not exposed. As we get towards 28 days and older, we see this huge activity, huge amount of spike occurring. What that tells me is these birds were unprotected and now they've been externally exposed to an IBD virus or a CAV virus. And why does this matter? Well, because both IBD and CAV are immunosuppressive viruses. So if birds are exposed mid-cycle, even without clinical signs, it can affect growth and our processing outcomes. So regular serology tests lets us track that immunity over time and allows us to see what's often hidden under the covers before they become issues with performance. Coccidiosis for our rearing and our broiler guys. Cocci is a protozoal disease caused by Myria species, and it's a major disease in commercial poultry. This life cycle really illustrates how repeated exposure to vaccine strains or field exposure can build immunity. So birds pick up the oocyst in the environment, it goes into their intestines and sporulates within the cells of the gut. Then they rupture out of the gut. They then push back into the gut and go again before then they are pooped out, and the cycle continues again. So it really underscores the idea that sort of a controlled exposure is important to develop immunity, but overexposure can cause disease. So we sort of talk about sort of our coccidiosis monitoring protocols, because serology won't do it for us. And this is where we sample 8 to 10 flocks per session, 5 to 8 randomly selected healthy birds between 18 and 38 days. And we perform scoring of their intestinal tract for cocci lesions, keeping records and keeping intestinal scrapings to just confirm what we're finding. Doing this every 4 months, or in best case every month, and correlating those changes can really give us an idea as to whether our vaccination programs or our control programs are efficient and working the way that we intend it to. Behavioural observations are subjective at best, but they can give you a head start on data trends. So feather pecking may precede, say, increased floor eggs or feed wastage or mortality. Lower perching may indicate either leg problems or fear, or potentially they haven't been trained in rearing. Huddling near our drinkers might suggest that they're either heat stressed or there's excess competition for that area. And maybe an uneven body weight distribution may foreshadow a performance variability as they get older. Sudden shifts in vocalizations can reflect stress or disease. And so by pairing these observed behaviour trends with quantifiable data like feed intake and egg production, quite often you can preempt or intervene before those production drops get too out of control. Now, you all thought you were going to get through a presentation without ugly chicken photos, but sorry, you're talking to a vet, and I have a whole camera reel full of these. So the images on this slide remind us that data and behaviour only tell part of the story. So whether that's post-mortem exams, whether that's looking at our mortality, whether that's looking at our liver, our intestines, our reproductive tract, or whether it's just simply looking at a bit of poo, it can tell us a lot about the cause of poor performance. And that might be worm infestations or nutritional deficiencies or even infectious diseases. So a skilled stockmanship should be able to identify these key components within their flocks. And even if you don't necessarily know why or what it is, being able to identify the normal versus the abnormal is half the battle. So having this and being able to have the conversation about this is what I'm seeing can really target some improvements to identify key components. So here we've got a bit of vent pecking occurring, causing some internal rupturing and internal egg peritonitis scenarios. Here we've got the start of a bit of preen pecking around the feathers. See, we've got a bit of white around the back end compared to this one here. Here we've got mucus and a lot of sort of diarrhea type manure. Keel bones, that can tell you a lot about the calcium levels in the feed and the activity of the birds. Maybe we don't have enough sequential perching. And then here we've got red mites. So ultimately, our goal isn't really just to detect problems. It's about trying to reduce the chance that they're going to occur at all. So building resilience involves stress management. And gosh, wouldn't we all love to know how to manage our stress? Controlling temp, ventilation, controlling our stocking density, controlling the way that the birds experience the environment that they're in. Maybe do some feed access auditing. It'd be quite surprising how many times I go onto farm thinking that the birds have got enough access when half the shed, there's been a blockage in the pipe or something. So go and audit the feed access. Ensure you've got that uniform distribution. Ensure you've got minimum competition occurring. Water system, I could honestly do a whole hour on water systems, but really think about preventing that biofilm and prevent that contamination within the water. If you aren't willing to take a drink out of the system, then your birds shouldn't be drinking that water either. And probably the most important thing is staff training. Really get your staff understanding how to recognize early behavioral changes or early data shifts. And align those management plans that you have with the physiological milestones that those birds are going to experience. So schedule the interventions that you're going to do when the birds are going to be the most receptive to them. So by proactively controlling the environment and equipping your staff around you to notice the subtle shifts in behaviour, we can really prevent issues from arising and catch them much earlier than being reactive in the way we do it. So basically, the whole hour that we're going to be here for really comes down to these 5 things. It's a 5-step model, and it's about monitoring continuously to gather data and observations, about detecting anomalies from that data by comparing to our SMART targets and baselines. It's about investigating systematically in a stepwise fashion, using our data, using our behavioural trends, using our disease checks and our active surveillance, and then acting with targeted interventions based on what that investigation shows. And probably the most important part of it is reviewing the outcomes to see what worked and to refine the whole process. Again, this should be a constantly moving circle. It's a continuous improvement loop designed really to keep our flocks healthy and productive. And just as a final thing to wrap up, I just want to shift our focus from data and diagnostics to the people, because at the end of the day, a high-performing production system is only as good as the person that's managing it. Even the best designed health plans, monitoring schedules, vaccination programs won't succeed without active management on the ground. And so what makes a great manager? Well, it comes down to one word, and probably my favourite word, and that's adaptability. Because real flock leaders don't just stick with what's always been done or what the manual says I should do. They're willing to change their habits. They're willing to accept new technology. They're willing to work as a team. And perhaps most importantly, they're willing to try out other people's ideas. And these simple but really powerful behaviour can separate those reactive operations from something that's truly proactive. So whether it's adjusting a ventilation setting or trialling a new cocci vaccine or simply just listening to your gut feeling, that active management is where all your training systems and strategies come to life. So while today's session has all been about science, remember it's people who turn these indicators into action, and that's what makes a real difference. Thanks so much for joining. I really hope that you got a bit out of this. I hope it deepened your understanding of some of our flock health indicators. I'm sure there is a lot more information and a lot more detail you would love, but I could talk for hours, and anyone that knows me would probably attest to that. So I'm going to open up for questions. But in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind scanning the QR code and just giving us some feedback, it's fully anonymous. It would be totally grand to know what you'd love to hear about next, and how you found the webinar. So if you'd like more information or support tailoring some of these principles to your farm, the Hatch House team is here to help. So we look forward to hearing what you found most useful today. The Q&A thing on the side is up and going. So if you've got any questions, flick them there. Otherwise, put your hand up. I'd love to chat. Everyone's super quiet. This is where we sit awkwardly. Peter.
Hey, how's it going? Hey,
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Just a quick question around data collection, because currently we just collect weekly data and compile it all from there. But as you were saying in your presentation, sometimes a couple of days of not doing anything could be detrimental to the flock. So, with my question is, data collection daily is better for picking up any irregularities in the flock and things like that?
Yeah, it's definitely probably So the problem with weekly data collection is great. Weekly is great for that reporting aspect, but
Yep.
if you're only looking at weekly data and not necessarily that day to day, you can't see the trends. And 7 days can be a really long time in a bird's life, and so a lot of things can happen from Monday to Sunday. So daily is definitely much more sort of proactive space for sure. In identifying some of those trends, and then when you start doing it, you'll probably identify, some variations, and it's going to be just trying to understand what variations require impact or intervention versus ones that you're just going to see it sort of track over time.
Yeah.
Alex, Kate, there's some questions here. Kate has asked, what are the best ways to help settle a flock after transferring from rearing?
So the best way would be to keep everything the same. So not overcomplicate the process. Keeping hopefully you've got a sister rearing flock rearing system to production system. So they look very identical. Keeping the feed the same across both, and whether that's introducing the layer diet in the rearing phase if you're moving late, or bringing that developer diet that you have as the last diet into the layer production system for the first week, just so they're not having to deal with a change in feed. Keep your temperatures the same, keep your lighting the same, don't stimulate on transfer. And I know some people will administer like an electrolyte or a vitamin mix or something on transfer. It's fine if they've been stressed or they've been travelled in summer or they've got a long travel time. But if you've only got a short travel time, sometimes doing that can be another stress component, because if the birds are accessing the water expecting to get nice, crisp, clean water and they're getting a dose of orange juice instead, it's probably not going to they're probably going to be more adverse to the idea of going back for that water. So keep it simple and try and just replicate rearing to production as best you can. Barindra.
After intramuscular vaccination, that is FC EDS or after FC IB killed, we see a dip down in feed consumption. That's the trend there.
Yep. And you're running Avery system?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the biggest concerns that we have over, and unfortunately Australia cops this a lot, we pick up the birds a lot, which obviously restricts them in that feed intake for the day or two that they've been vaccinated. The easiest way is to make sure that the trough is full before you start vaccinating, so you get the best chance. But if you're also locking up a portion of birds in that top part of the aviary, there's going to be a period of time where they're not going to have access to feed. So you're going to have that variation. The best way is try and get those birds down as quickly as possible and get access to feed, which I know is not an easy solution. But yeah, it is a really tricky space, Bridrinda, to work through the vaccinations and you're picking them up. You've just got to try and align, make sure you're not getting a feed change at that point in time, make sure you're not doing lighting changes at that point in time, and make sure you maybe even extending the lighting hours slightly just to allow them to have access for those couple of days. Yeah.
Do you reckon stress vitamin or something after vaccination, after a few days or something?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that would be, particularly for the ones that have been locked up for a period of time and don't have that access. Yeah, the best way would be to administer it the day before vaccination, because it primes the body to hold on to water and provides them those, particularly those amino acids that they wouldn't be getting from feed for a period of time. So yeah, it's definitely more of a proactive the day before sort of treatment.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Selvin, is there a mandatory cocci protocol for layer hens? No, there's not a mandatory cocci protocol. Probably the best way to monitor cocci takes would be to do oocyst counts of fecal material over time, so every couple of weeks, to identify whether you're getting good sporulation if you're vaccinating. If you're not vaccinating and you're not getting mortality, and you're not seeing drops in production, then I'd say everything's looking pretty good and intervention's probably not needed. But if you are vaccinating, the risk with vaccinating is you don't get that sporulation and that cycling occurring properly. And then that can result in a sort of almost like an overgrowth of cocci before the birds develop immunity. So no, there isn't. That's not an easy question to answer. There's not a cocci protocol. It really depends on your type of what you're doing, what your organisation's doing. Great questions, guys. No more?
So,
Yep.
Alex, I've got a question.
Oh, hey, David.
So why wouldn't you just vaccinate at so many weeks in any case, whether there's a problem or not?
What vaccination are you specifically referring to?
Well, any of those, the graphs that you showed there that, their resistance drops off at so many weeks. Well, why wouldn't you just vaccinate anyway?
So cost is a big one. And in Australia, we have a lot of vaccinations over here, and a lot of them require the birds being picked up in order to administer it. So it can be quite a costly exercise to give them everything that's on the shelf.
Yeah.
But I always say it's an insurance policy if you protect yourself. So if you've got the ability to do it, great. But yeah, that's a lot of the reasons as to why people are umming and ahhing about certain vaccinations. And it also depends on the risk. So for instance, caged birds that are on town water are probably at low risk to fowlpox, which is transferred by mosquitoes. And so they may not necessarily be vaccinated for that based on the risk profile. Yeah. Versus, say, a free-range farm that pulls water from a dam would be at a high risk of a egg drop syndrome disease. And so I would highly recommend EDS vaccination. So it really depends on the organisation and certain bits and pieces throughout your farm.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, David.
Oh, thank you.
All righty. I'll give you 6 minutes of your time back. Thank you so much, guys, for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah, if you've got any further questions or want to flick us an email, yeah, just let us know. But yeah, hopefully we'll see you at the next one. If you want to see me, I haven't looked at the results yet, but if you want to see me. So thanks so much, guys. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank
See
you.
you later.
Bye.
Bye.